The last satellite feed went dark at 6:14 in the evening, and after that, nobody on Earth could see what was gathering above the clouds. 600 warships hung in low orbit, each one large enough to cast a shadow over an entire district. They had arrived, without warning, folding out of compressed space like a fist unclenching. The Dravani Empire had done this 19 times before on 19 different worlds, and the result had always been the same. Surrender within 3 days. Occupation within a week. Resource extraction within a month. Earth, classified in their records as a Level 2 primitive world, was expected to be no different. Fleet Commander Asura stood in her command chamber aboard the flagship and watched the planet rotate beneath her, blue and green and swirled with white. It looked fragile. They always did. She opened a channel that reached every frequency on the surface. Her voice, translated into every major Earth language simultaneously, was calm and precise. She told them what the Dravani always told new subjects. Surrender all military assets. Dissolve all governing bodies. Accept Dravani administrative authority. Comply, and civilian populations would be spared. Resist, and the strikes would begin. Earth's Unified Defense Council responded within the hour. They asked for terms. They asked for time. They asked for clarification on what compliance would look like. Asura had seen this before too. Stalling. Primitive governments always stalled, hoping for a miracle that would never come. She gave them 12 hours. They used every minute of it, not for negotiation. Behind the diplomatic back and forth, military commanders across the planet were doing something the Dravani had never encountered. They were not preparing to fight the fleet. They knew they could not win that war. Instead, they were hiding. Weapons were moved into tunnels, basements, caves, and abandoned mines. Fuel and medical supplies were scattered across thousands of secret locations. Communication equipment was buried in waterproof containers. Soldiers were told to memorize rally points, destroy their uniforms, and disappear into the civilian population. The orders came from the top, and they were simple. When the strikes come, do not stand and die. Survive. Go underground. Wait. The 12 hours expired. Asura gave the order. The first wave of orbital strikes hit every major military installation on the planet simultaneously. Bases, airfields, naval yards, missile silos, and command centers were reduced to craters in a matter of minutes. The second wave targeted communication infrastructure. Broadcast towers, satellite uplinks, undersea cables, and server farms were erased. The third wave, 6 hours later, hit government buildings. Parliaments, presidential palaces, courts, and administrative centers burned. By the end of the first day, Earth's conventional military capability was functionally destroyed. By the end of the second day, every national government had either collapsed or gone silent. By the middle of the third day, Asura received confirmation from her ground sensors that organized military resistance had ceased across all continents. She filed her report to the Dravani High Senate. Earth conquered. Resistance neutralized. Occupation phase commencing. Ground forces began landing. Tens of thousands of Dravani soldiers in heavy armor, supported by armored transports and aerial drones, touched down in every major population center. They expected to find a broken species waiting to be governed. And on the surface, that is exactly what they found. Humans walked through the rubble of their cities with blank faces. They lined up for water distribution. They did not make eye contact with the soldiers. They looked defeated. Asura watched the landing reports from orbit and felt the familiar satisfaction of a clean operation. 19 worlds, 19 victories. This was number 20, but beneath the surface, in a collapsed subway tunnel under a city that no longer had a name on any functioning map, a man named Denial sat on a concrete slab and counted heads. 11 people. 3 of them had been soldiers. 2 were paramedics. 1 was a mechanic. The rest were ordinary civilians who had followed the sound of his voice through the smoke and rubble because he had been shouting directions while everyone else was screaming. Denial was 54 years old. Retired military. Bad knee. Gray at the temples. He had spent the last 20 years teaching history at a small university, and he had spent the last 3 days watching everything he taught become irrelevant. Nations, borders, treaties, alliances, all of it was ash now. But history had taught him one thing the Dravani did not know. Every empire that had ever occupied a land it did not understand had eventually learned the same lesson. Holding ground was harder than taking it. He looked at the 11 faces in front of him. Dust-covered, bleeding, terrified. One of them, a young woman who had been a pharmacy student 3 days ago, asked him what they were supposed to do now. The government was gone. The army was gone. Everything was gone. Denial reached into a pile of rubble and pulled out a length of metal rebar. He held it up. "This is a weapon," he said. "And so is the rubble under your feet. And so is the darkness in this tunnel. And so is the fact that there are 8 billion of us on this planet, and they do not know which ones are fighters and which ones are not." He told them that the war everyone thought had ended 3 days ago had not ended. It had not even started. What the Dravani had destroyed was the old war, the kind fought with armies and flags and battle lines. The new war will be fought differently, in shadows, in silence, in patience. That he looked at each of them and said 5 words that would be repeated in tunnels and basements and forests across every continent in the months to come. Now the real fight begins. Above them, the Dravani flag was being raised over the ruins of a city they believed they owned. Below them, in the dark, 11 people began to plan. 3 months after the conquest was declared complete, a Dravani supply convoy carrying fuel cells and ration packs for the eastern garrison disappeared on a mountain road. All 14 vehicles, 41 soldiers, gone without a distress signal, without a single shot registered on orbital sensors, without a trace. Asura read the report twice and then ordered search team. They found the vehicles at the bottom of a ravine, buried under a landslide that looked natural until a geologist on her staff pointed out that the rock face above the road had been cut with precision charges. Someone had studied the geology, calculated the fracture points, and waited for the exact moment the convoy passed beneath it. Was the first incident. It was not the last. Over the next 4 weeks, the occupation began to bleed. Communication relays on 3 continents were sabotaged every night. Repair crews would fix them by morning. By the next night, they were down again. Patrol units sent into forested regions walked in and did not walk out. Their tracking signals simply stopped, one by one, like candles being snuffed. Water purification units at a northern mining outpost were contaminated with a compound that did not harm humans but caused violent sickness in Dravani digestive systems. 30 soldiers were hospitalized. The compound was traced to a common earth plant that grew wild in every ditch and field on the continent. Asura called a strategy meeting with her senior officers. She asked a simple question: who was coordinating the attacks? The answer came back from intelligence, and it was the answer she did not want to hear. Nobody. There was no central command, no communication network they could intercept, no leader they could kill to make it stop. The attacks were being carried out by independent cells operating on their own initiative, using their own resources, following no orders from anyone in the Eastern Mountains. Denial's cell had grown from 11 to 63. They lived in a network of caves that had been used as storage for a mining operation decades ago. They ate what they could hunt and what sympathetic villagers left at dead drop points along mountain trails. They struck Dravani targets once or twice a week, never from the same location, never using the same method twice. 2,000 kilometers to the south, in a region of wetlands and mangrove forests, a former schoolteacher named Halima ran a different kind of operation. She had organized the fishing communities along the coast into an intelligence network. Every fisherman who went out on the water watched Dravani patrol boats and reported their routes, their timing, their blind spots. When Halima had enough information, she would send a team in small wooden boats to plant explosive charges on the hulls of Dravani vessels while they were docked at night. She had sunk 11 patrol boats in 8 weeks. The Dravani had not figured out how on the western coast. A young engineer named Ren worked in the basement of a collapsed factory, building weapons out of scrap. He had studied Dravani technology from capture equipment and discovered something useful. Their armor was designed to stop high-velocity projectiles and energy weapons. It was not designed to stop fire. A simple mixture of fuel and chemical thickener, packed into glass bottles with a cloth fuse, could burn hot enough to penetrate the joints of Dravani body armor. It was a weapon that humans had invented centuries ago. They called it a Molotov cocktail. Run called it justice. None of these three had ever met. None of them communicated with each other. They did not need to. They were fighting the same war for the same reason. And the methods they used came from the same deep well of human stubbornness that the Dravani had never encountered on any other world. Asura began studying human history in her private quarters at night. She pulled records from the planetary data archives her forces had captured and started reading. She read about a place called Vietnam, where a technologically superior military had been bled dry by fighters in tunnels. She read about Afghanistan, where empire after empire had broken itself against mountains and the people who lived in them. She read about partisan fighters in forests, about resistance movements in occupied cities, about ordinary people who had chosen death over submission so many times across so many centuries that it could not be called bravery. It was something deeper than that. It was instinct. She found a word that appeared in almost every account. Guerrilla. It came from an old Earth language, and it meant little war. She said it out loud in her empty quarters and felt something she had not felt in 19 conquests. She felt afraid, because the pattern was always the same. A powerful force would take the land. The people would bend. And then, slowly, quietly, from the shadows and the margins and the forgotten places, the little war would begin. And it would not stop. It never stopped. Not until the occupier left or the last fighter was dead. She looked at the casualty reports on her desk. 62 Dravani soldiers killed in the last month alone. More than she had lost in the entire conquest of the Talari homeworld, a campaign that had lasted a full year. She closed the file and stared at the wall. This was supposed to be the easy one. The burning started on a Tuesday. Asura, after weeks of mounting losses and no actionable intelligence, gave the order to deny the resistance its cover. If the fighters hid in forests, the forests would be removed. Dravani gunships swept across 3 continents, spraying incendiary compounds over thousands of square kilometers of woodland. Ancient forests that had taken centuries to grow were reduced to blackened stumps in a matter of hours. The smoke was visible from orbit. Then came the drones. Thousands of hunter-killer units, each one equipped with thermal sensors and autonomous targeting systems, were deployed into the regions where resistance activity was highest. They flew low, scanning for heat signatures that did not match the profile of approved civilians. Anything that moved in restricted areas was targeted. Anything that ran was killed. Then came the rewards. Asura authorized a bounty program, broadcast on every remaining communication channel. Any human who provided information leading to the capture or death of a resistance fighter would receive food, clean water, medical care, and protected status. It was a strategy that had worked on 6 other worlds. Turn the population against the fighters. Let them destroy themselves. On every other world, at least one of these methods had worked. On Earth, none of them did. The forests burned, and the fighters moved underground. They dug deeper into cave systems, expanded old mining tunnels, built hidden shelters beneath the ruins of bombed cities. Denial Cell relocated 3 times in a single month, each time leaving behind nothing but empty caves and false trails. The burned forest became a different kind of weapon. Charred tree trunks provided no cover for Dravani patrols either, and the resistance fighters knew the terrain in ways the drones did not. They knew where the ground was soft enough to dig a pit trap overnight. They knew which ridgelines had blind spots in the drone patrol patterns. They knew how to mask their heat signatures with mud and wet cloth, a trick so simple it should not have worked against advanced technology, but it did. The drones killed hundreds. But for every cell destroyed, new ones formed. A farmer who had never held a weapon in his life watched a drone strike, kill his neighbors, and walked into the nearest resistance camp the next morning. A doctor whose clinic was rated for treating wounded fighters started performing surgeries in a basement by candlelight and told every patient where to go when they were healed. A teenager who lost her entire family to a drone sweep memorized the flight patterns over her village and passed the information to Halima's network, which used it to bring down 3 drones in a single night with nothing more than steel cable strung between rooftops. The bounty program was the most spectacular failure. Not because no one was tempted. People were starving. People were desperate. But the resistance had embedded itself so deeply into the civilian population that informing on a fighter meant informing on a neighbor, a cousin, a friend. The social cost was absolute. In one village, a man accepted Dravani food in exchange for the location of a weapons cache. He was found the next morning sitting outside his door, alive, but with every possession he owned piled in the street and set on fire. No one had touched him. No one had threatened him. No one ever spoke to him again. He returned the food. Asura requested reinforcement from the High Senate. Her message was carefully worded, but the desperation underneath was clear. She had lost 400 soldiers in 6 months. Her supply lines were under constant attack. Her troops were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly afraid of an enemy they could not see. She needed more ships, more soldiers, more drones, more everything. The Senate denied the request. Their response was blunt. Earth had been officially conquered. It appeared in the imperial records as a pacified world. Sending reinforcements would mean admitting that the conquest had failed, and the Dravani Empire did not fail. Asura was told to manage the situation with existing resources. She read the Senate's reply 3 times and then deleted it. That night, she pulled up the casualty projections her analyst had prepared. At the current rate, she would lose 1/3 of her occupation force within the next year. Replacements were not coming. The humans, meanwhile, seemed to have an endless supply of fighters. They came from everywhere. Old men, young women, children who carried messages through checkpoints because the Dravani did not think to search them. Entire communities that appeared compliant during the day and became hostile the moment the sun went down. Run, on the western coast, had made his most significant breakthrough yet. He had figured out how to repurpose captured Dravani power cells into directional charges that could punch through the armor plating on troop transports. He taught the method to 6 other cells through hand-delivered written instructions carried by runners who traveled on foot through territory the Dravani believed they controlled. Halima sent a message to Denial through a chain of couriers that took 11 days to arrive. It contained 3 words. They are afraid. Denial read it in a cave lit by a single candle, surrounded by fighters who had not seen sunlight in a week. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He would carry it for the rest of the war. 1 year into the occupation, a Dravani soldier stationed at a checkpoint outside a ruined city wrote a letter home to his family on the Dravani colony world of Isara. He wrote that he had not slept more than 3 hours in a row for 2 months. He wrote that his unit had lost 9 soldiers in the past 30 days and that replacements were not coming. He wrote that the humans looked at him during the day with empty eyes, and at night those same humans tried to kill him. He wrote that he wanted to come home. The letter was intercepted by Dravani military intelligence, flagged as a morale concern, and filed. There were thousands like it. The occupation was crumbling from the inside. Dravani soldiers who had been told this assignment would last 6 months were now entering their 2nd year on a planet that hated them. They patrolled streets where every shadow could hide a fighter. They drove roads where every bridge could be wired. They slept in fortified bases that still got hit by mortar fire made from plumbing pipes and mining explosives. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers flinched at loud noises. Officers refused to travel without armored escorts. Entire units requested transfer to other assignments and were denied. The resistance, meanwhile, had grown into something that no longer resembled a scattered collection of desperate survivors. It was a network, not a centralized one, not a hierarchy with ranks and orders, but something more organic and far more difficult to destroy. Cells communicated through couriers, dead drops, coded messages scratched onto walls, and signals as simple as a particular colored cloth hung from a window. The methods were primitive by galactic standards. They were also almost impossible to intercept. Denial had become a name the Dravani knew. Not because he led the resistance, because no one led the resistance, but because Asura had made the mistake of putting a bounty on him. It was meant to isolate him. It did the opposite. It turned him into a symbol. When word spread that the Dravani were afraid enough of one man to offer a reward for his death, Fighters on the other side of the planet took it as proof that the occupation was losing. Denial used that reputation exactly once. He gathered 40 fighters, the largest force he had ever assembled, and attacked a Dravani forward operating base in the Eastern Mountains. The base housed 200 soldiers and was protected by walls, automated turrets, and drone patrols. By every military calculation, the attack should have been suicide. That IT lasted 11 minutes. Denial's fighters hit from 4 directions simultaneously, using Ren's repurposed power cell charges to blow the main gate and the drone control antenna in the first 30 seconds. In the confusion, teams moved through the base with a speed and violence that stunned the defenders. They were not trying to hold the base. They were not trying to win a battle. They took weapons, medical supplies, and communication equipment, set charges on the fuel depot, and disappeared into the mountains before the Dravani could organize a response. Denial walked out with a piece of shrapnel in his shoulder and 40 fighters still alive behind him. Every single one of them. The fuel depot exploded as they reached the tree line, and the light from the fire was seen for 30 kilometers. The story spread across the resistance network within a week. It was exactly the kind of victory that mattered, not because of the material damage, which was significant, but because of what it proved. The Dravani were not untouchable. Their bases were not unbreakable. Their technology could be beaten by people who were willing to bleed for the chance. But the cost of the war was not something anyone could ignore. For every story like Denial's raid, there were 100 quieter ones. A cell in the northern flatlands wiped out by a drone strike while they slept. A courier caught at a checkpoint with coded messages sewn into her clothing, executed on the spot. A village leveled because a single resistance fighter was seen entering it 3 days earlier. The ratio was brutal, and everyone knew it. For every Dravani soldier killed, 10 human fighters died. Halima lost her nephew in an ambush that went wrong when a patrol arrived early. She did not stop operations for a single day. Ren lost 3 of his best weapon builders when a Dravani raid hit a workshop they thought was hidden well enough. He moved to a new location and started again the next morning. Denial buried fighters in unmarked graves on mountainsides and said words over them that he made up because there was no priest and no book and no tradition that covered what they were doing. The resistance fought not because it was winning. By the numbers, it was not. It fought because the alternative was to kneel, and every person who picked up a weapon or carried a message or hit a fighter in their home had already decided that kneeling was not something they were willing to do. The Dravani had conquered the land. They had never conquered the people. And slowly, month by month, the difference between those two things was becoming the only thing that mattered. Asra knew it. She stood in her command chamber and looked at the map of Earth on her display, covered in red markers showing areas of active resistance, and realized that after 1 full year, the red had not shrunk. It had grown. The first Dravani desertion happened quietly. A soldier on night patrol near the southern wetlands simply walked away from his unit, left his weapon on the ground, and sat down by the side of a road until morning. When his commanding officer found him, he refused to move. He said he was done. He said he would rather face military punishment than spend another night in a place where the darkness itself wanted him dead. He was arrested and sent to a holding facility on the command ship in orbit. Within a month, there were 40 more like him. Asura buried the numbers in classified reports, but the reality was impossible to hide from the troops on the ground. Morale had not just fallen, it had shattered. Soldiers who had served the Dravani Empire with pride on other worlds now talked openly about Earth being cursed. Junior officers began refusing high-risk patrol assignments, citing equipment failures that did not exist. Garrison commanders started pulling their perimeters tighter, abandoning outposts in remote areas because they could not guarantee the safety of the soldiers stationed there. Every abandoned outpost was stripped clean by the resistance within hours. The puppet civilian government that the Dravani had installed was collapsing from within. The administrators, all humans chosen for their willingness to cooperate, had been quietly feeding intelligence to the resistance for months. Patrol schedules, supply routes, garrison strengths, communication codes. Everything the Dravani shared with their collaborators ended up in the hands of fighters within days. When Dravani intelligence finally discovered the leaks, they purged the entire administration and replaced them. The new administrators began doing the same thing within a week. 2 years into the occupation. Asura sat alone in her quarters and wrote the report she had been avoiding for months. It was classified at the highest level. It was addressed directly to the High Senate, and it said, in language that was precise and unflinching, that Earth could not be held. She laid out the numbers. Total Dravani casualties now exceeded the combined losses of their last 5 planetary conquests. Troop strength was down 30%, with no replacements available. Supply costs for the occupation had surpassed the projected resource value of the planet 3 times over. The resistance was larger, better armed, and more coordinated than it had been at any point since the invasion. Every strategy she had employed, military force, technological superiority, economic incentives, collective punishment, had not only failed to suppress the resistance, but had actively strengthened it. She concluded the report with a recommendation. Withdraw. Reclassify Earth. Leave. The Senate's response arrived 2 days later, and it hit Asura like a physical blow. They would not withdraw. Withdrawal was not in the Dravani vocabulary. Instead, they ordered escalation. Orbital bombardment of confirmed resistant strongholds, regardless of civilian proximity. If the humans would not submit, they would be reduced to a number small enough to govern. Asura read the order and did not move for a long time. She had conquered 19 worlds. She had burned cities and shattered armies and watched civilizations fold under the weight of Dravani power. She had done all of it without hesitation because the calculus had always been simple. Resistance was temporary. Submission was inevitable. Break enough of them and the rest would kneel. But she had spent 2 years studying these people. She had read their history. She had watched them bury their dead and walk back into the fight the same day. She had seen a species that treated suffering not as a reason to stop, but as fuel to keep going. And she knew, with a certainty that sat like a stone in her chest, that orbital bombardment would not break them. It would kill millions. It would turn cities to glass and fields to craters. And the survivors, however few, would crawl out of the rubble and start fighting again. They would fight with rocks and their bare hands if they had to. They would fight until the last one of them was dead. And even then she was not sure they would stop. She pulled up a communication channel she had never used before. It was an old frequency, one that had been established during the initial invasion for ceasefire negotiations that never happened. She did not know if anyone was still monitoring it. She transmitted a short message, unencrypted, in plain language. She asked to speak with denial. The response took 3 days. It came through a chain of intermediaries so long that Asura suspected it had passed through a dozen hands before reaching her. It was 4 words. Name the place and time. Asura stared at the message and realized something that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. She was about to negotiate with a species the Dravani Empire had classified as primitive. Not from a position of strength, from a position of desperation. She named a location. A bombed cathedral in the neutral zone between the nearest Dravani garrison and the nearest known resistance area. She named a time. 3 days from now. She said she would bring 2 guards. The response came faster this time. 1 word, agreed. Rain was falling through the holes in the cathedral roof when Asura walked in. The building had been grand once. Stone arches, stained glass, carved pillars that must have taken human hands years to shape. Now it was a skeleton. Half the walls were gone. The altar was a pile of rubble. Water pooled on the cracked floor and reflected the gray sky above. She brought 2 guards as promised. They stood behind her with their weapons lowered but ready, scanning the shadows. Denial was already there. He stood near what was left of the altar, alone. No guards. No weapons visible. He was thinner than the intelligence photographs had shown. His hair had gone fully white in 2 years. There was a scar running from his left eyebrow to his jaw that had not been there before. His left hand was missing 2 fingers, the stumps healed rough and uneven, battlefield medicine at its most basic. He wore clothes that had been patched so many times they were more thread than fabric. He looked exactly like what he was. A man who had been fighting every single day for 2 years and had not stopped long enough to heal. Asra dismissed her guards to the entrance. She walked forward until she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the conqueror and the conquered. Except the word conquered did not fit, and both of them knew it. Asra spoke first. She told them about the Senate's order. Orbital bombardamento. Targeted strikes on every confirmed and suspected resistance position. Civilian casualties would be in the millions. She told him that she had the power to prevent it, but only if the resistance agreed to a conditional surrender. Lay down arms. Accept limited Dravani governance over resource extraction. In return, civilian populations would be protected and resistance fighters would receive amnesty. She told him it was the best offer he would ever receive. Denial listened without interrupting. When she finished, the rain was the only sound for a while. Water dripping through broken stone. The wind moving through empty window frames. Then he spoke. He told her about a woman named Halima who had lost her nephew to a Dravani patrol and went back to work the same afternoon. He told her about an engineer named Run who had rebuilt his weapons workshop 4 times after 4 raids and was currently building his 5th. He told her about a teenager who ran messages through checkpoints by hiding coded notes inside loaves of bread. He told her about an old farmer who had never fired a weapon in his life until the Dravani burned his fields, and who had since become one of the most effective saboteurs in the Southern Network. He told her about the people she would be bombing. Mothers who hid ammunition under their children's beds. Teachers who taught resistance codes disguised as math lessons. Doctors who operated by candlelight in basements because every hospital had been destroyed. He said that in 2 years, not one of these people had asked to stop fighting. Not when they were starving. Not when they were burying their families. Not when the odds were so far against them that hope itself should have died. He looked at Asra and said something that she would later record in her personal logs, word for word. He said that if the Dravani burned the world to glass, the last human alive would scratch a resistance symbol into the ash with a broken fingernail. He said that surrender was not something his people did. Not because they were brave, because they were stubborn, because giving up required something that humans simply did not have in them. Asra stood in the rain and looked at this man, this aging, scarred, half-broken human standing in the ruins of a building his own species had built with their hands, and she understood. Not just intellectually. She understood in the way that changes what a person does next. She returned to her command ship that evening. She sat in her quarters for 1 hour. Then she did 3 things. First, she transmitted her resignation to the High Senate, effective immediately. Second, she ordered the fleet to withdraw from Earth orbit. Third, she filed a formal recommendation that Earth be reclassified in the Imperial records. Not level 2 primitive. Not contested. Not under pacification. She used a word that did not exist in the Dravani classification system. She invented it. Unconquerable. The Senate was furious. There were hearings, investigations, calls for her arrest. But the fleet was already gone, the troops already evacuated, and no other commander volunteered to take her place. The file on Earth was quietly sealed and buried in the deepest archives of the Dravani military database. 3 years later, a Dravani diplomatic envoy arrived in Earth orbit. Not a military fleet. A single ship carrying diplomats and translators and trade proposals. They were requesting permission to land. They were asking to negotiate as equals. The landing coordinates were approved. When the envoy's shuttle touched down, Denial was waiting at the edge of the landing pad. He was older, more scars. The 2 missing fingers on his left hand were still missing. Behind him, where there had been rubble and ash 3 years ago, a city was rising. Half-built, scaffolding and cranes and raw concrete. Messy, imperfect, alive. Denial extended his right hand. The Dravani ambassador looked at it, looked at the city behind him, and took it. The handshake lasted 3 seconds. It was the beginning of the first treaty the Dravani Empire had ever signed with a species it had tried to conquer. In the Imperial Archives, Earth's file remained sealed. But the word Asura had written on it leaked, as these things always do. It spread to every conquered world in Dravani space. It was whispered in mines and factories and labor camps by species who had submitted and species who were thinking about not submitting any longer. Unconquerable.it was just a word. But words, like humans, have a way of refusing to die.